Okay, you might remember last time we met, we had gotten into Marx and Engels' writing of the Communist Manifesto. And if you recall, really it was a paper that focused on the struggle between the proletariat, the business owners, the people who own the means of productions like factories, and the bourgeoisie were the ones who owned factories and everything. The proletariat, which is Latin for property poor, are the laborers, the ones who work in these factories and things. And so I'm going to continue that discussion on this point today. In order to end this travesty of social justice, where the bourgeoisie takes advantage of the proletariat, where the rich got richer while the poor got poorer, the Communist Manifesto declared that it is inevitable that the working class proletariat, who outnumber the bourgeoisie 100 to 1, will rise up in revolution against the property owning bourgeoisie. However, unlike most revolutions where the rebels win and take over the wealth and political power of those ousted, the Communist Manifesto also declared that the victorious proletariat should abstain from this temptation, should abstain from enriching themselves for the benefit of the community, which is the root word for communist. Instead, they must use their new power to abolish, not keep, all private property. Private property needed to be in the hands of the community. There would be no private property, in other words. All property would belong to the commune, the community. And this would completely level the playing field and therefore rid society of the evils of social class. Only in doing this would conflict end and society stabilize, according to the Communist Manifesto. After all, if no one claimed they own the means of production or business, there'd be no division between owner and worker, differences would disappear, and the spoils of industry could be divided equally among the people. Matter of fact, one of the most famous lines of the Communist Manifesto went, "To each according to his need, from each according to his abilities," meaning that if you're a doctor and you're really smart and you can do doctor things, well, then rather than being paid $1 million a year, you would be paid the same as the janitor, but everybody would be provided for. And because you're smart, that's kind of your obligation to the community to use your smarts for the benefit of everyone. The janitor, maybe not so smart, didn't have as much education, didn't come from a good family home or something. He's going to do what he can with what he's got, and then he also will be a part of the community and everyone will be provided for. I will say this, agree or disagree with the Communist Manifesto, that Karl Marx is probably the single most influential social scientist in world history today. And he's the most assigned author in college classes today as well for that reason. So whether you agree or disagree with Karl Marx, I'm not going to sit here and try to sway you one way or the other. It's important to understand that he had a huge impact on Western civilization from the point of the Communist Manifesto well into today. Most government arguments, such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal, arise out of Marx's teachings. So moving away from that, communist revolution, which, we'll get into where times in the world it's actually happened. But right now it's just an idea. Marx and Engels are economic philosophers putting forth the idea here. But there actually is a real war going on at this time, and it's called the Crimean War. And if you don't know anything about geography, the Crimea is south of Russia near the Black Sea, and it's a warm water place. Now, the one thing you have to understand about Russian geography, and you probably guessed this, Russia is huge. Russia goes from the Pacific all the way to, into Europe. Part of Russia is in Europe. So it covers most of Asia and part of Europe. Huge country, land-wise, it's number one in the world. You'd think its population would be number one in the world, but it's not. Why? Well, because most of Russia is just frozen wasteland. There's nothing to it. Matter of fact, the north of Russia, they border an ocean in the north of Russia, but it's the Arctic Ocean and it's freaking frozen, 9 months out of the year. So Russia can't really engage in a lot of shipping, and so, or naval defense. And so after Napoleon, later on Hitler, Russia is very nervous about having to fight land wars and not having any naval defense or trade capabilities on the ocean. And so they're always looking for a warm water port so that they can own, that they can engage in these things. It's one of the driving motivators in Russian foreign policy to this day. keep and maintain a warm water port. And that's exactly what's going on here in the Crimean War. Most people consider compromise the key to maintaining a working democracy. And most Americans know by now, the less our leaders seem willing to compromise, the less actually gets achieved in the end. But compromise isn't the only aspect of democracies. In the early 19th century, the European powers attempted to compromise with one another in order to make a lasting peace in Europe when they created the Congress of Vienna. But when this compromise broke down, yet another war took place, the Crimean War. So how did we get to the Crimean War? Well, we have to go back to the Congress of Vienna and discuss it a little bit to understand what happened there. You got to remember, the Congress of Vienna is super important to world history because it's the first time that there's this major international accord of several countries attempting to keep peace. And you can see that in the modern United Nations. Think of the Congress of Vienna as our first attempt at a United Nations. So after the final defeat of Napoleon and his subsequent exile in 1814, the victorious powers of Europe, which at this point was basically everyone but France, gathered at the Austrian capital, Vienna, to try and figure out a stable settlement for Europe. The diplomats tried to safeguard Europe against the intermittent but frequent conflict that had plagued it for centuries by divvying up territory and spheres of influence that everybody would agree, this is yours, that is mine. So the countries also tried to work out solutions and plans that would maintain the political status quo in each country, making significant upheavals like the French Revolution impossible into the future. Now, this agreement worked for several decades until one of the signatories and the major powers, the Ottoman Empire, which held large parts of the Balkans and Eastern Europe for centuries, began to fall apart. Matter of fact, the rest of Europe referred to it as the old sick man of Europe. The Ottomans were under pressure from France and Russia to grant special privileges in the Holy Land to the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. And attempting to pressure the Ottomans into granting the Eastern Orthodox Church special concessions, Russia invaded and occupied Ottoman territory in Moldavia and Wallachia in July of 1853. Now, the Ottoman Empire, of course, is outraged at this encroachment upon its territory and declared war on Russia in October. And despite being able to quickly mobilize their forces, the Ottoman fleet was smashed by the Russians in the Black Sea, forcing the Ottomans back to port on Asia Minor, or in Turkey. The other powers of Europe were worried that Russian advances into the Balkans and possibly even the Middle East would ruin the Congress of Vienna's, what they call the concert of Europe, everybody working together to maintain this balance. But this balance of power was pretty precarious, and it was not going to last if the Ottomans fell and there was no one to claim power in the East. Additionally, Great Britain was worried that Russian control or influence in the Middle East would disrupt Britain's trade routes to India and the Far East that ran through the Mediterranean Sea, basically through Egypt. France also had an interest in getting involved in the conflict because the new French president, Napoleon III, nephew to Napoleon Bonaparte, and we'll get to his story here in a bit, had recently declared the Second French Empire and was eager for military victory. Military victory against the Russians would be symbolically important for the French, as it was defeat in Russia which had signaled the begin of the end of the First French Empire. Remember Napoleon's march to Moscow. So as a result, Britain and France demanded Russia leave Ottoman territory by March of 1854, and they sent fleets to the Black Sea in early 1854 to secure Ottoman ports and trade routes. And when Russia failed to leave the territory, Britain and France declared war on Russia. Eventually, Russia did evacuate the territory in the summer of 1854, but only after Austria threatened to join the Allies if Russia failed to heed the demands. And despite this, France, Britain, and the Ottomans landed forces in Russia and Crimea on the north shore of the Black Sea in September of 1854. And though some fighting occurred in the Baltic Sea, most of the military action occurred here as the Allies conducted a long siege of the Russian city of Sevastopol. After over a year of heavy fighting in and around the city, the Russians resigned themselves to defeat and left Sevastopol. However, they also blew up forts, munitions, and boats at port, essentially anything they could not take with them on their retreat. And with heavy casualties taken on all sides, the Allies' nominal victory in Crimea was the only result of nearly 2 years of conflict. In order to force a peace favorable to the Allies, Britain and France prepared an invasion fleet in the Baltic, threatening to land at St. Petersburg. Now, they probably had very little intention to actually go through with the invasion. The buildup of the force had its intended effect, though, and Russia signed another Treaty of Paris in March of 1856. And according to the treaty, the Russians had no claims to the Ottoman territory that they had invaded. In addition, Russia was outlawed from keeping any kind of military presence in the Black Sea, and they lost territory in the Balkans. Now, the Balkans are where World War I eventually is really the powder keg that's going to start, and it's because of Russian interference in there. So we're starting to see the Congress of Vienna cracking into the 1850s. Well, 60 years from now, 80 years from now, in the early 20th century, we're getting into the proximate causes now of World War I, which was the proximate cause of World War II. And so, these are very important events, even though they seem kind of arbitrary and out there, and what's the big deal? So the impact of the Crimean War is very, necessary to understanding why the world wars. The Crimean War signaled several things to the major European powers. The peace created by the Congress of Vienna was shattered largely due to the vulnerability of the Ottoman Empire, the old sick man of Europe. And securing the Middle East and the Balkans from being dominated by any one major European power would be the chief concern of Great Britain and other European powers for the next century. And defeat also proved to the Russian government that further modernization was necessary if Russia wanted to have its power felt on the international level. Their armies were no match. They were still using muskets in the 1850s, which is weird because rifles were pretty predominant by that point. And so they were just no match for the European powers. And the war affected more than geopolitics, too. Most military historians consider the Crimean War, especially the maneuvers in and around Sevastopol, to be one of the most bungled operations in history. Much like the event even more devastating First World War only a half century later, advances in weaponry had made the current military maneuvers obsolete. Considering this, it seems even more egregious that the vast majority of deaths in the conflict came from disease due to poor supplies and poor planning. Hundreds of thousands of Russians perished, and the French and British lost approximately 100,000 and 25,000 troops, respectively. In fact, the British folk hero nurse Florence Nightingale, who I'm sure you've heard of, was made famous for her actions in the Crimean War, helping these people who were sick. So that's the Crimean War. That's the end, basically, of the concert of Europe and the Congress of Vienna. What's going on in Southern Europe, though? The people who aren't really France or the whole, not the Holy Roman Empire anymore, Austria-Hungary, and what's going on there? Well, let's talk about Italy. If you recall, Italy is a collection of several different states to this point. And the countries of Europe today almost seem like second nature to us growing up in Western society. So if we think of Italy, it's that whole country. But Italy, Germany, and England, all these and others conjure certain images of landmark, people, food. And considering this, it may come as a surprise to some of you to learn that as little as 150 years ago, Italy as a cohesive political entity just didn't exist. For a few minutes, we're going to trace the 19th century developments which fostered the unification of Italy into the country that we know it of today. So for most of the medieval and early modern periods, the territory that makes up modern Italy was a fragmented region, often under control by monarchs elsewhere in Europe. And while the Pope carved out states around Rome as his own personal kingdom, northern and southern Italy often alternated between local rule and periods under control by foreign powers like Austria, Spain, France, or the Holy Roman Empire. And this political reality had created large regional differences between different parts of the peninsula. But most of the region still came from a similar ethnic background and shared similar customs and the Italian language. In the first few decades of the 19th century, Italian nationalism grew in the peninsula, and calls for a united Italian state grew in aristocratic and intellectual circles. And this period of movement is known as the Italian Risorgimento, or reorganization, literally the resurrection. Early groups which wanted more rights and liberalism from their foreign rulers eventually coalesced in the 1830s into the group Young Italy under the charismatic leadership of a guy named Giuseppe Mazzini. And Mazzini not only wanted a unified Italy, but he wanted the new Italian state to be a republic. So Mazzini resolved the only way to achieve this was through revolution. And as foreign revolutions swept across Europe in 1848, Mazzini seized his opportunity and called for a pan-Italian revolution, pan meaning greater all. So Mazzini himself led a guerrilla force into Rome, seized the city, and declared Rome a republic, causing the Pope to flee. And though the revolutions around Italy during that year were all eventually quashed by foreign powers, the revolutions showed that the enthusiasm for an Italian state was present. So whereas Mazzini might have had the fervor, the next man with the real political power and acumen to unify Italy was a guy by the name of Camillo Benso de Cavour. And he was the prime minister of the most powerful independent Italian state in the early 19th century, Sardinia. Now, in addition to the island of Sardinia, the state also controlled Savoy, Piedmont, and Nice in northern Italy. So Cavour had been prime minister of Sardinia since 1850, and his original intentions were simply prestige and power for Sardinia. But his goal, uniting more Italian territory under the same flag, was one and the same with those who wanted an Italian state. Moreover, Sardinia had a moderate king, a guy by the name of Victor Emmanuel II, who ruled jointly with the Sardinian parliament, a political system those wanting an Italian republic would likely accept. They want more say in the government, they want to be a republic, and a constitutional republic, much like England's, would be very attractive to them. So, hey, we can join together, basically. We see mutual goals in our movements. Cavour realized that the most powerful nation in northern Italy, their main competition in the mid-19th century, was Austria, who possessed the large and rich territory of Lombardy. Now, knowing Sardinia could not defeat the Austrians by themselves, Cavour tried to position Sardinia in a politically advantageous position by entering the Crimean War on the side of France, Great Britain, and the Ottoman Empire in the mid-1850s. Excuse me. Now, did they do a lot? No. But, hey, you can use our ports. We'll send you a few troops. We're your buddy. Basically, he's getting ingratiated into the cool kid crowd. So meanwhile, Cavour continued to strengthen Sardinia and its territories from within. He built railroads. He improved the military technologically. And though Sardinia joined the war late and made very little real impact on the outcome, Cavour's move had gained Sardinia powerful international friends in Great Britain and France, who were simultaneously upset with Austria for steadfastly refusing to get involved in the Crimean War. So with help secured, Cavour stirred up nationalist rebellions in the territory controlled by Austria. And Cavour's troops invaded from the Sardinian territory of Piedmont, and Napoleon III of France immediately sent French troops to aid in the Sardinian effort. Now, the conflict didn't take long, and Austria surrendered Lombardy to Sardinia, which now gave Sardinia control of the whole of northern Italy, basically. At the same time, Italians in Parma, Tuscany, and other central and northern Italian states rebelled against their independent rulers and joined Sardinia in the hope of creating a pan-Italian country. So now almost half of Italy is part of the Kingdom of Sardinia. So with northern Italy now largely under the Sardinian flag, Cavour sent Giuseppe Garibaldi with a small force to southern Italy in 1860. Garibaldi was a longtime Italian revolutionary and had been part of Mazzini's force that attempted to set up a republic in Rome in 1848. His forces were wildly successful, but the assault on the southern territories nearly stopped before it even began. Garibaldi was furious with Cavour in Sardinia after he learned that in return for French help against the Austrians, Cavour had ceded Savoy and Nice to France. They were no longer, and still are, no longer part of Italy. They are part of France. Garibaldi was actually from Nice, and he's like, I don't want to be a Frenchman. So he's kind of outraged, and the very city for which he was hoping to unite Italy was now French. Somehow, Cavour placated him, and Garibaldi began his campaign, swiftly conquering Sicily before crossing to the southern Italian countryside, encountering little resistance along the way. Garibaldi finished his campaign, and in October of 1860, he turned his conquests over to Victor Emmanuel of Sardinia. And in 1861, Victor Emmanuel proclaimed all his territory, the whole of that boot plus Sicily and the little islands, Sardinia, Corsica, to be part of the Kingdom of Italy. Not Corsica, I apologize. Corsica belonged to France now. The only parts of modern Italy which remained outside this new country were the Papal States and Venice. And realizing a direct attack on the Pope would lead to international intervention, Cavour secretly encouraged riots and protests in the Papal States, and before long, 2 of the 3 states joined Italy, leaving Rome standing alone. Rome was protected by the French, and Venice was still under Austrian control. The new Italian state, of which Cavour was the first prime minister, bided its time, and in 1866, with Austria at war with Prussia, Italy saw their opportunity and joined the Prussian cause. And after Prussia's victory, Italy annexed Venice. Prussia proved an able instrument yet again 4 years later, when a conflict between France and Prussia caused France to have to pull its troops out of Rome to face the Prussians. And with Italian troops at its doorstep, Rome voted in 1870 to join Italy, and to placate the Pope so he wouldn't ask for international assistance, they gave him the current smallest country in the world, Vatican City. So when people think of Germany, people often think of the same things: beer, sausage, lederhosen, perhaps even soccer. In other words, they tend to think of Germany as one homogenous country. And it's not. It's much like Italy was. It's a lot of different little countries and places. So that notion couldn't be further from the truth. And indeed, as few as 150 years ago, modern Germany just did not exist at all. And it took the advent of German nationalism and Germany's first great statesman to make it happen. So some background to how we get from this broken several different principalities and states in Germany to the modern state of Germany today. The common criticism of the precursor to modern Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, was that it was neither holy, Roman, nor an empire. Indeed, though Germany as we know it today was nominally united under an imperial crown for almost a millennia, in reality, the German lands were composed of approximately 300 individual principalities and city-states that largely operated in independence of one another. And though certain powers dominated different parts of the German lands throughout the Holy Roman Empire's history, it was not until the 17th century that early modern Germany's 2 greatest powers, Prussia and Austria, began to expand and incorporate more and more German territory under their respective flags. In the early 19th century, Napoleon's conquest of the German lands ended the Holy Roman Empire. After Napoleon's defeat, the German states created the loosely associated German Confederation in 1815, containing all the territories of the former empire with majority German speakers. Now, power within the Confederation was dominated by the 2 largest states, Prussia and Austria. And that's where we'll pick up tomorrow, same time. We'll start talking about how this fight for power in the German Confederation over who was going to lead it leads to kind of the decline of Austria and the rise of Prussia, and eventually the unification of the Confederacy into one nation, Germany. So I hope you guys are doing okay. Hope you have a good day.